Hey everybody, Radical Dreamer Steve back at you with another gaming video, and I am so excited for this one. I'm probably more excited than any of my past videos, because this is going to be the first part of a long-running series about sort of growing up as a gamer. It's going to be a mixture of storytelling, what it was like for me, the people around me, and the people who experienced being a part of gaming history. Like today we're talking about the fourth generation, the SNES versus the Genesis. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people, younger people, who don't really know what it's like to have grown up in the 80s or 90s or even the early 2000s and what it was like to be a gamer and how different it was in these different periods. My intent with this video is to really talk about what it was like to live through this period. I want to set the stage before I actually get into the actual experience. So the SNES and Genesis, the fourth generation of gaming, was dubbed the Console Wars. It's really the first generation in home consoles where there wasn't a single player, Nintendo in this case, dominating the entire scene. In the 80s with the NES, Nintendo had basically controlled the whole market. They had draconian contracts that locked in third-party developers and had them make games exclusively for the Nintendo for X amount of years, and they had to output a certain amount of games. This is why it was absolutely huge that Sega, this scrappy little company from Tokyo, managed to not only compete with the Super Nintendo, but actually beat it in terms of numbers for a couple of years and win a sort of cultural battle to some extent. While Nintendo mostly stuck to platformers and having kind of third-party developers like Squaresoft, Enix, Konami, Capcom dump a bunch of their games on the Super Nintendo, Sega basically had to fight Nintendo with giant ad campaigns targeting older gamers. They had to kind of set themselves apart by seeming like the cool kids on the block, while Nintendo was the kind of boring, family-friendly choice. Sega also had to work with a much slimmer selection of third-party developers. Eventually, they did kind of get companies like Capcom and Konami to develop a few games for the Genesis, but Sega was basically developing most of their games themselves, or working with sort of, I wouldn't call them indie companies necessarily, but smaller companies. Like one example comes to mind is Treasure, who made Gunstar Heroes. That's an absolute cult classic on the Sega Genesis. So for me personally, I was a child at this time. I was born in 1988, so I ended up getting a SNES pretty late in the life cycle, around 1994 or 1995. I was blissfully unaware of most of the generation. While I wasn't a part of the whole generation, this was where my roots started, and this is why I wanted to sort of tell the story of the SNES versus Genesis rivalry and give people a glimpse of what it was like to be a child during this. And I really hope to eventually make videos on the 5th generation, 6th generation, 7th generation, and even make some videos about specific hardware, consoles, or even specific software that sort of mixes storytelling, history, and a retrospective all in one video. So how I started with this generation is when I was visiting my grandmother's house, I saw my cousins playing this machine called the Super Nintendo. They were playing Super Mario World in the just then released Donkey Kong Country. So this is 1994. This absolutely blew my mind. I remember seeing these games and being like, oh my God, what is this? This is totally different than all my other toys. And so I had played these games, stunk terribly, fell into pretty much every pit imaginable, died instantly, probably made my cousins to immediately want to rip the controller from my hands. But what happened was, as soon as I got back to my parents' house, I basically begged for a Super Nintendo in these very games. My dad ended up taking me to the store, and I got a SNES, and I got Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario World. Those were literally the two games I started out with. Of course, as a kid, I had no real income, and nobody in my family really played video games. So I didn't really know anything about when they were getting released. I didn't know which games were really considered good. I basically had no idea. I was blissfully ignorant and just wanted to experience more of these kind of video games that I already had. I had Mario and Donkey Kong. Now I wanted something a little bit different. I lived in Maine. My grandparents lived in Augusta, Maine. So Augusta was a very small city, and there was a tiny little hole-in-the-wall video game shop. I mean, the size of a bedroom. But they were just loaded with games. Most of the consoles, I had no idea what they were. Nowadays, I probably recognize them as TurboGrafx games, Nintendo games, Sega Genesis games. But at that time, the only thing I knew was the Super Nintendo. I wanted to go to this store every time I visited my grandparents. I would beg my grandfather, please, can we go to this store? And he would sometimes agree, though he would usually tell me, okay, if you attend the sermon with me and go to church, I will bring you there after. I found the sermons dreadfully boring. However, usually I would make the trade so I could visit the shop. And the one thing I remember, I think I bought a few games that were not so good from that store, But one of the games I luckily picked up was Kirby Superstar. And it's kind of funny. The reason I picked up Kirby Superstar was because it said 8 games in one. I thought, oh my God, I can't really get many games. I don't have any income. This game has 8 games in one. This should take me a while, and it looks really cute and fun. They told me it was a platformer, kind of like Mario. So I got Kirby Superstar, ended up being one of my favorite Super Nintendo games, obviously one of the most popular Super Nintendo games of all time. But around this time, I had visited some of my other friends' homes in school, and I saw another console, this slick-looking black box called the Sega Genesis. And I didn't know what this was. I asked my friends to play it. They would usually be pretty excited to do it too. They love video games as much as I did as a kid. And so they would put on this game called Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and eventually Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and it blew my mind. The first thing that really blew my mind was how fast Sonic was. It blew Mario out of the water in terms of speed, and it was just totally different. And in Sonic 2, I remember I was mind blown because 2 players could play on this screen at the same time. With Mario World, you generally had to wait. One player would play a level, the other person is just sitting there waiting for you to finish the level. And in Donkey Kong Country, you had to tag in the other player. But Sonic 2, Sonic and Tails are running around at the same time. Now, to me, nowadays, this isn't a very fun multiplayer game because Tails basically just gets lost, especially with how fast the game is. But as a kid, you had to think we weren't quite as picky and analytical about these things, so it felt really revolutionary. And I remember my friends showing me Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2, and these games, I was like, oh my God, there's nothing on the Super Nintendo I've ever seen that's like this. And Mortal Kombat, there's blood everywhere. I remember getting punched, uppercutted through this, you got uppercutted and you fell through this crack in the ground onto this pit of spikes. There's blood everywhere, skulls, and there's fatalities in the game. And I was like, oh my God. Like the Sega Genesis is edgy. As a kid, it felt that way because I was playing Mario and Kirby and Donkey Kong, and here my friends are playing this this blue blur, Sonic speeding through levels and uppercutting people into spikes with blood everywhere. And it felt pretty risky, and it was just cool. I mean, there's nothing like it. And keep in mind, at this time, commercials were huge, and there was a lot of commercials for the Genesis that were pretty edgy as well. I saw a lot of these commercials. For some reason, I remember Sonic 3D Blast more than anything, which is really, really random. It's a game I've played a few times. It's okay. I don't love it. I don't hate it. But let me return to the SNES, because the SNES, I don't want to make it seem like the SNES wasn't cool. The SNES was absolutely cool. That was just because of the wealth of amazing platformers it had at that time to me. Now, yes, it had many, many amazing RPGs, and RPGs is my favorite genre. But at this time, I knew nothing about those RPGs. For me as a young kid, it felt like all these platformers, Mario World, Yoshi's Island, Donkey Kong Country, Kirby Superstar, it felt like every game I was playing was this knockout hit. Like, oh my God, this console is just so many good side-scrollers and platformers. And I met my best friend John around 4th or 5th grade, and he had a Super Nintendo, he had a Sega Genesis. He was going to basically have every console. He was just that kind of kid. He was a huge gamer. His mom really supported him playing. She didn't really mind. And so he's really the guy that got me into games. And around this time, he had shown me the newfangled PS1, which blew my mind. I remember seeing Twisted Metal 1 and being like, oh my God, like this is next level. Like it's actually 3D. But he also had a Sega Genesis, and he was a huge fan of the Sega Genesis. And he had tried to get me to play many of the games, like Ristar. Ristar I didn't really take to. It felt like kind of a watered down platformer next to Mario. And I still feel that way. Ristar has never really captured me. He also tried to show me Phantasy Star games, which were like these kind of RPGs. But at that time, Phantasy Star 3, which is oddly the one I played, I don't remember why. I didn't really like it. And so that didn't really click with me. The thing that happened, though, that why he changed my life is he had showed me a game called Shining Force 2. He had really touted this game as like the most amazing game he had ever played. And we spent a lot of time in my house playing Kirby Superstar and Donkey Kong Country and Mario World. We had so much fun, but it felt like he had this holy grail in his apartment. He's like, you got to try this game, man. This is my favorite game, like on the Genesis, and it's so good. He actually, I remember my friend had told me he had kissed the screen when he was like 4 or 5, kissing when one of his favorite characters, Slade, came on from Shining Force 2. And so, I was like, yeah, I guess I got to try this game. I got to find out what this is all about. It's something that's a Super Nintendo doesn't have. It's something that's totally different than what I'm playing. Like, what is this? And so he had booted up this game. He had shown me playing a little bit. And I remember I was instantly mind blown. I was like, holy cow. There's characters. There's a story. There's epic battles. Fantastical music. I mean, dude, this game is just like the books I'm reading or the movies I'm watching. Oh, you can actually play the damn adventure yourself. Like, I was mind blown, literally. And I beat the entire game in subsequent visits to his house, and I really wanted more. I was like, oh my God. But, the Super Nintendo, I had that Super Nintendo. I didn't know anything about the RPGs. I didn't know about Final Fantasy. I didn't know about Chrono Trigger. I didn't know about Secret of Mana. I didn't know about any of these games. And so it felt like my box had been contained to platformers, which I absolutely loved. And I had a great Super Nintendo collection of all these platformers and a few other odds and ends. I had like Mario Kart and Frogger and a few other games. Well, Frogger is technically a platformer. A few other games I really liked. But it would take me a long time before I revisited the Super Nintendo's RPGs. And it turns out the PS1 was actually going to be the console that really got me into the genre. So I do hope to make a future episode on SNES RPGs because they are really good, but I didn't discover them until well into the PS1 and 5th generation of gaming. I didn't find them until maybe the late 90s. Since I was there for the end of the generation, I didn't realize the Genesis was kind of on life support. The 32X came out as a massive flop. The Saturn had a terrible launch. I didn't realize the Genesis was in that dire condition because when I went to my friends' houses, they had all these cool games. And I remember this Sega Channel. The Sega Channel was a service that Sega Genesis owners could subscribe to where they could stream about 50 games at a time. And the games would switch every month. And a few of my friends had the Sega Channel. And it just seems so cool. I would go over there and be like, oh my God, you can just choose from these like 50 games to play. Like I've got like these like 12, 13 Super Nintendo carts sitting in my living room, but I can't choose, like I can't play anything else unless I go out and buy it. So to me, this was amazing. It felt like the Genesis was cutting edge, edgy, kind of futuristic, while the Super Nintendo was really good, but very safe. Don't get me wrong. I'm still on, I'm mostly on Team SNES here. I've always been throughout my whole life, but my perception just from seeing the Genesis at my friend's house was always that they had something that was just a little bit different than what I had. It was a little bit foreign and exotic and just kind of, it seemed edgy and futuristic. Whereas my Super Nintendo seemed like the safe place. Like these games are amazing on it. These are probably my favorite games of the two generations, but those kids that own the Sega Genesis have just all these cool services that I don't have. I recently talked to my friend who's now in his 40s. He's in his late 40s, so he grew up well before I did. And he was talking about the NES and the Master System and how he would see ads on TV. For the Genesis, he'd be like, yeah, you'd see this like red plumber running across to this level and, trying to save a princess. Or you could choose that, or you'd see like Sega's commercials with like space shooters and Space Harrier and blowing things up. And you're like, yeah, which one do you think a 13-year-old boy would gravitate towards? And this was kind of how Sega, I think, ended up really competing, was they got teenagers and young adults on board. Whereas Nintendo, they took so many of their old fans back into the Nintendo. But don't forget that a lot of people felt burned when the Super Nintendo came out because it wasn't backwards compatible. The SNES could only play SNES games. So a lot of people that bought the NES were kind of frustrated because the Genesis, even though people didn't own the Master System, Sega really advertised that, yes, we're backwards compatible. You can play your Master System games. But the Super Nintendo is absolutely not backwards compatible, despite making amazing hardware and probably being better than the NES, in my opinion anyway. It wasn't backwards compatible. And so the Genesis appealed to this wide audience. It was cheaper. It had backwards compatibility. They had edgy ads. They seemed like they were the console for like older people. And Nintendo really relied on their kind of third parties in their main series. They obviously had games like Super Metroid and Kirby Superstar and Mario World. All these games sold consoles because Nintendo really knows how to develop good games. And they had like Squaresoft making Final Fantasy, Capcom making Mega Man X, Konami making Castlevania 4. They had all these amazing games. So they really sold the console based on the software, the amazing software that was developed for it. Despite the fact that a lot of Sega fans never really bought a Sega Saturn, a Sega Nomad, of course, people didn't buy that, a Sega Dreamcast. After buying the Sega Genesis, this was Sega's time to shine. They sold almost as many units. They sold over 35 to 45,000 Sega Genesis units, whereas the Super Nintendo sold 49,000. For a developer like Nintendo, they were supposed to trump Sega and just absolutely stomp the ground with them, but it ended up being almost a deadlock tie battle. Sega really has something to be proud of, and the Sega Genesis remains one of the better consoles of all time. Now, I just want to point out that I'll kind of tell you how my story ended. So I got a Super Nintendo, and I remember having it until 1996 or so. And I remember when everyone was super excited for like Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, I was getting like Donkey Kong Country 3 on my Super Nintendo. And it wasn't until a couple years later that I had a PlayStation. With the PlayStation, I came in mid-generation instead of the end. And I played so many PlayStation games. I can't wait to talk to you guys about that generation. Yeah, I had my Super Nintendo for a long time, and I loved it. So my Super Nintendo was really special to me. It's a console I always go back to. It's kind of comfort food for me. And it has some of my favorite games of all time, like Donkey Kong Country 2, Chrono Trigger, Yoshi's Island, just some of these amazing games that have never really been replicated ever since. And to me, the Super Nintendo is one of the best consoles ever made. So for me, this was a magical time, partially because it was my inauguration into console ownership, and partially because I didn't know much about the industry. It just felt so magical every time I played a game. I'd get a game, and you don't know when you're going to get the next game. Might be weeks later, might be months, might not be for a year. So when I got something like Kirby Superstar or Donkey Kong Country 2, I played the crap out of it. And I almost 100%ed most of these games I got because I put so much time into them. So that's my story here. I really, really love this generation. They're both consoles I play from time to time. I always return to Shining Force 2 every few years. Chrono Trigger is still one of my favorite RPGs of all time. And I always feel like I return to the Donkey Kong Country games more so than any other games on the Super Nintendo, other than maybe Chrono Trigger. So these are great consoles. So for you guys, I'm really curious. First, which console did you own if you owned one? And if you weren't alive for this generation, which console do you prefer? And please give me your top 5 favorite games for these consoles. Here's mine. Super Nintendo, off the top of my head, I'm going to go Chrono Trigger, Donkey Kong Country 2, Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, and Final Fantasy VI. And for the Genesis, I'm going to go Shining Force 2, Sonic 2, Lightning Force, Streets of Rage 2, and probably Sonic and Knuckles. Other than the original Sonic, which I find kind of overrated, I absolutely love the Sonic games on the Genesis. They're amazing. All right, guys, that was a really fun video to make. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. That was a lot of fun to make, and I can't wait to see you guys next time. All right, game on.